Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Inna alhamdulillah. Indeed, all praise is due to Allah. We thank Him in all situations, and in some ways, you begin to appreciate. Like there's a message going around about, when this is all over, be extra thankful for being able to go to restaurants, being able to meet friends and talk to them. Just enjoy the freedoms that we used to have and are slowly being taken away from us for a short while, inshallah. So we thank Allah for all circumstances. Alhamdulillah fi kulli hal. And peace and blessings be upon Allah's Messenger, about whom we are talking today, inshallah. Okay, so what we're going to see in this presentation, and I do think that this is going to take more than today's presentation to complete for sure, is that the way of the Prophet ﷺ, the Sunnah, is deeply inspiring, and that's what defines us, is that we are people who aspire to follow the way of the Prophet, after all, right? And there's an obligation to follow it. There has to be. That's what it's about. But what we also see, and we've seen up till now already, but I'll just reiterate and clarify that, is that the Imams of the four madhabs, the four famous schools of Islamic law, saw it as their duty to try and clarify what the Sunnah is. What is the way of the Prophet? How do you follow the teachings of the Prophet? And they try to encapsulate those into a kind of digestible form, in a way. But what's interesting is that they all had slightly different interpretations, and that's amazing, because it means that difference is valid, because nobody says that, oh, the only madhab acceptable before God is, let's say, the Shafi'i madhab, and all the others are, na'udhu billah, in the hellfire or something, as a complete deviation. Or, everyone has a deference for all the different madhabs, despite them coming up with quite different verdicts, right? So that leaves us with this sense that there's a huge heritage of valid opinions out there. Okay, and very often, especially on campus, there'll be one opinion that's being drummed down, and it's being forced upon you as being the opinion. The Prophet said this. This is the right way. Okay, honestly, the truth is far from that. And in fact, if you're at the last course with Sheikh Munir, you would have seen how there's difference of opinion, and how actually that's enriching, that's in some ways liberating, right? And so when you look at the Imams, some of them were quite literal, and some of them more analytical. Okay, so there's kind of almost like two approaches to understanding the Sunnah. Okay, and that's allowed for us as well. And we'll see which of those. Well, we'll see which of those is more valid. Okay, so we're going to come to that, a very interesting and very relevant discussion. So, that then leaves us to the question of, okay, well, which one is most relevant to our context? And we'll discuss that, bi'idhnillah. And what we'll come to, if we have time, is that the interpretation of hadith isn't always simple. It's not as simple as opening up Bukhari or Muslim, finding an authentic hadith and going, right, Prophet said, this is what we do. Okay, it really isn't. And it requires a depth of understanding, bringing together the Quran, the teachings of the Quran, and all the other examples and teachings of the Prophet, analyzing the opinions of different companions maybe about Sunnah. So it requires a huge amount of thought and analysis. And this is what's called fiqh, which is the Arabic for understanding. So the scholars of fiqh, the faqihs, are people who understand the full depths of the teachings and can then give you a solution to specific contemporary problems. Okay. And so we see that many of the Imams didn't see individual hadith as being the Sunnah, right? So I kind of gave the title Hadith versus Sunnah. Well, I mean, it's not like there's some kind of battle going on, but it's that they're not the same, okay? And that you know, there are so many valid opinions. We've talked about this, and you're not forced to follow one. On the concept of tajdeed, I mentioned already that these imams were trying, they're kind of revolutionaries. They all brought something unique and special to the table, all of it around the idea of sunnah, about, you know, how do we encapsulate the life example of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so that if people want to follow that, where are they going to find it? Yeah, because you can imagine, right? So let's say at the time of Imam Malik, somebody wants to follow the sunnah of the Prophet. They're gonna, there's lots of different scholars with lots of bits of knowledge of this and that, and it's just kind of, you know, it's like a marketplace of opinions. So it's really hard to kind of like, you know, find a simple way of, right, okay, what did the Prophet want us to do in this situation? Okay, and that's what Imam Malik tried to do. Okay, and all the other imams codified their laws, or their students did it, so that, you know, it, if you wanted to follow the way of that imam, it was all there within a generation of that imam. But they all brought different and unique special perspectives, right? So what we're going to do here is just do a quick recap of where the madhabs came from. We've done this before, but for anyone that's new, we'll go over that again. As you know, it's fascinating because they didn't all emerge separately, and they weren't inauthentic. They weren't kind of, you know, they didn't come around, you know, sort of centuries after the Prophet sallallahu. Okay, there was a strong tradition of one learning from the other, but then going slightly in a different way, because they're all phenomenal thinkers, as well as being, you know, immense characters. And we've done that. We've looked at their personalities and how much they suffered actually for their faith and for the truth that they strongly believed in. But they, despite their sincerity and, you know, or because of their sincerity and their kind of sharp intellect, they all saw things in a slightly different way, even though they learned from each other. Okay, so look at that. We're going to look at the meaning of sunnah, and then we're going to look at how the imams contributed towards sunnah, and we're then going to look at that very interesting discussion of reason versus, you might say, literalism. Okay, and, you know, which madhabs did which. We will then, if we have time, start looking at the interpretation of hadith. And there are so many different approaches to individual hadith and how you interpret them. And we'll look at some hadith that maybe are, you know, appear problematic, are really sometimes quite hard to understand. Remember the one I've already posed to you. In fact, I've posed two to you already. And, you know, certainly the one about, for instance, women not being able to travel without a mahram is a very common one that you come across, and the ruling, that's the kind of literalist ruling from that, actually makes life very difficult for many of you if you're, you know, if you hear it. And, you know, some people do actually, you know, try to follow that madhab as well, or that opinion, should I say, right? So we'll look at that. We'll look at how to analyze hadith. And then finally, we're going to have a look at what our approach should be towards the madhabs. Which madhab do you choose? Okay, so we'll see what I have to say about that. Where did the madhabs come from? You've seen this diagram before. What I've done this time is try to correlate that on one side with the dates as well. Okay, so you can see that on the left-hand side, we've got the chains of learning of the imams, and on the right-hand side, we have the dates. Okay, so I'm just going to take you through that. Start with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet did hijrah, and remember, Islamic dates are done according to hijrah, the hijrah calendar, which is the migration. So the Prophet made the migration to Medina. The calendar was started from there, I think from the time of Umar radiallahu anh onwards. The Prophet passed away 10 years after making hijrah. So start the clock from 10 years after Hijrah. And we can see how some of the key companions, particularly ones that had followers that later taught some of the Imams, actually, right? So these companions died, you know, sometimes quite a lot later than the Prophet. So Anas bin Malik was the servant boy of the Prophet, and he narrated quite a few hadith. We'll see some of the hadith narrated by Anas bin Malik. So he was closely associated with the Prophet, and Allah granted him a long life. So he actually died 83 years after the Prophet passed away. So you can see how many students of the companions who were born, you know, as you can see, like 20, 10, 15, 30 years after the Prophet, many of them will have seen the companions. And even some of the students will have seen people like Anas bin Malik. So, you know, there's that continuity. And sometimes you get this idea and people say, oh, well, you know, these rulings just were made out of nothing. Muhammad didn't even exist. And quite ridiculous things like that. But when you actually look at how soon afterwards the chain of learning began, and how consistent it was, that, you know, you might argue about the validity of one or two hadith, but you can't throw away the entire corpus of knowledge that was transmitted directly from the Prophet through the companions and their followers downwards, right? So you have the disciples of the companions, and for instance, I've just mentioned two there. One is Ata ibn Rabah, Ibn Abi Rabah, who saw, I think both of these were African actually, who saw lots and learnt from, I think, 200 companions, if I remember rightly. And then Ikramah al-Barbari, so he's from North Africa, the Berber, and he was a student of Ibn Abbas. He was a slave of Ibn Abbas, freed, I'm pretty sure, and then studied closely with Ibn Abbas. And Abu Hanifa went to study with both of these. He also studied with other companions, Tabi'un as well. So, you know, Hamad was his first teacher, who was a student of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, another companion. So we can see that Abu Hanifa, in terms of chain of learning, was very close to the Prophet ﷺ. He learned from people who had been the disciples of the companions, right? So in terms of time, he was very close to the Prophet, and the amount of learning that he got directly from the people who had known the Prophet's own companions, right? Okay, so then so Imam Abu Hanifa is a disciple of the disciple, Taba Tabi'in. Okay, and then, for instance, there's Ja'far Sadiq, who's the Shia's fifth Imam, and a descendant of the Prophet ﷺ, and he taught both Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik, for instance. And Imam Malik, born a little bit after Abu Hanifa, about 13, 15 years after Abu Hanifa. Okay, as I said, they had teachers in common. Then Abu Hanifa had a student, Abu Yusuf, who became the Chief Justice of the Islamic Empire. Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani is very interesting because he was devoted to Abu Hanifa, but only managed to sit with him for 2 years before Abu Hanifa passed away. Then Muhammad ibn al-Hasan studied with Abu Yusuf, and then after that spent 2 years with Imam Malik as well, right? And Imam Shafi'i, who came later, so Imam Shafi'i was born 140 years after the Prophet, but he was a student of Imam Malik and also studied under Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, as well as countless other scholars, of course, right? But you can see how close the chain is. So Imam Malik had spent his entire life studying closely with all the scholars who were themselves students of companions, or students of the students of companions. And, you know, he observed them closely. He took all of their opinions. He garnered their knowledge, gathered it together until he was the supreme scholar of Medina, of the city of the Prophet ﷺ. And Imam Shafi'i was a devoted follower of Imam Malik. He'd memorized his book, the Muwatta, and then after memorizing it, he went at an early age, in his teens, to go and study with Imam Malik and sat at his feet, essentially. So this is how close that chain of transmission of knowledge was. And then, yeah, Imam Shafi, he studied, respected Muhammad ibn al-Hassan, but had immense differences, to the point that he even wrote a book which was called Rad Muhammad ibn al-Hassan, the refutation of Muhammad ibn al-Hassan. Seems like quite a harsh thing to write about your teacher. Muhammad ibn al-Hassan, he wrote the story that Imam Shafi became a governor of Yemen, and he got embroiled in some intrigues, to the point that he was caught, brought in chains before the Khalif of the time, Harun al-Rashid. And Muhammad al-Hassan was the judge in the city at the time. So so we've got a question about why don't they accept the school of Ja'far ibn Ja'far as-Sadiq, because they both studied under. Well, so that's a good question. Why didn't Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik accept the school of Ja'far? Because the Ja'fari school is the Shia madhab, essentially, of the 12 Shia madhab. Well, they didn't accept each other's madhabs, even though they studied under. So Imam Shafi studied under Imam Malik and Abu Hanifa's student, Muhammad al-Shaybani, but they didn't follow each other's madhabs, right? They were phenomenal intellects who had their own independent thinking, right? So, that's a simple answer to that question. I think it's a lot more complex, and I'm sure I'm not really qualified to give a detailed answer to that. But there are other issues about the validity of the hadith, etc., from these different sources and what have you. But anyway, right. So yes, going back to this. So Imam Shafi was brought before Harun Rashid in chains, and it was actually Muhammad ibn al-Hassan al-Shaybani who defended Imam Shafi, recognized that this is a man of immense learning, and then Imam Shafi became his student after that as well. So they got introduced to each other. So after that, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, interestingly enough, was taught initially by Abu Yusuf, the student of Abu Hanifa, the long-standing student of Abu Hanifa. So Ahmad bin Hanbal was spotted as being a phenomenal character. He's always known for his immense piety and renunciation of the dunya, and his immense devotion, sharpness of memory and intellect. And Abu Yusuf took him under his own wing and started his tutoring. But then after that, Imam Ahmad studied also under Imam Shafi'i briefly, but also amongst, he was primarily a hadith scholar. So he traveled and learnt hadith from so many people, to the point that he knew 600,000 hadith. And from just 2 hadith scholars, he wrote down 300,000 hadith. And his corpus is one of the largest collections of hadith. Okay, so there we go. This is the chain of knowledge. And subhanAllah, it's so enlightening to learn how, close to the Prophet these people were. Okay, when they came with opinions, it wasn't just kind of, off the top of their head sort of thing. So the interesting thing is that Imam Abu Hanifa, as I said, was closer in generations to the Prophet, and in some ways you could say in teaching, in terms of receiving knowledge, but he was further in context. So you see a difference between Imam Malik and Imam Abu Hanifa in how they responded to their understanding of the Sunnah as well. We'll come to that. Right, so the meaning of the Sunnah. Sunnah means the path or the way, right? So it's the way of the Prophet ﷺ. And this is the interesting thing, is that you could say that the Sunnah is how the Prophet lived his life, but could you not also say that the Sunnah is how the Prophet would live if he was here today? So you could extrapolate the Sunnah, and if you can analyze the message of the Prophet ﷺ, then you could say, well, today, he might not dress the same, might not speak the same language if he was in our context, but this is what he would want us to be saying and doing. Do you see? And some of the Imams were very keen to look at that angle as well. So in terms of the importance of following the Sunnah, you know, that's absolutely clear. So you've got it in the Quran. Say, if you truly love Allah, then follow me. Yeah. And in the Quran also it says that indeed there has been for you in the Messenger of Allah an excellent pattern, uswatun hasana, an excellent pattern to follow. Right. So you get your inspiration from the Quran, and the connection, the conversation with Allah, with God, is through the Quran. But then if you want to see how to practically live out that life, that has got to be through the living example of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yeah, so the hadith as well of the Prophet, that all of my followers will enter paradise except those that refuse. And the companion says, you know, Allah's messenger, who will refuse? And he says that whoever obeys me enters paradise, and whoever disobeys me is the one who refuses, i.e. enters hell. And you know, this hadith in which the Prophet said that the best speech is the book of Allah, the Quran, okay, and the best way is the way of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, so the Sunnah is important. Why is it important? Because it gives us a model to follow, right? When Aisha radiallahu anha was asked about the Prophet, she said, "Kana khuluquhu al-Quran," that his character was the Quran. He was the embodiment in the way that he behaved. And you know, when you actually look at the character of the Prophet, you think, well, this is the Sunnah, right? This is the person. This is the way that we all want to live as well, right? So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when for instance he went to Ta'if, you see an example of how devoted he was to saving people from the fire, to connecting them with the Creator. So he went to Ta'if to spread the message, and they pelted him with stones until blood was pouring down his face and sticking to his sandals. And the Prophet and the companion narrates that the Prophet resembled a prophet who was harmed by his people. Many prophets had been before, and the Prophet resembled another one of those. And he wiped the blood from his face, and he said, "Oh God, forgive my people, for they know not what they do." And this is what Isa alayhi salam said. It's what many prophets before them said as well. Subhanallah. But the prophets were not here for comfort. They were here to bring that guidance, to bring that light. Yeah. The characters that Anas bin Malik we mentioned, who died 83 years after the Prophet and lived over 100. So he said, he notes about the character of the Prophet. You see many hadiths from Anas about that. And he says that Prophet did not swear at anyone. Yeah, he wasn't rude. He didn't curse anyone. And if he wanted to reprimand someone, essentially what he would do is he wouldn't name the person, but he would just say generally about a person that, oh, what is wrong with such and such person, type of thing. You know, may dust be cast on his face. And he taught himself about the quality of good character. And he said the best thing that mankind has been given is excellent character. Subhanallah. Isn't that amazing? You know, لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ, that we have certainly created man in the best of molds, and then we allow him to become the lowest of the low. But it's character that elevates man. Yeah. In the Quran it says, لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam, that we have certainly ennobled the descendants of Adam, the children of Adam. And it means basically that we have given them good character, right? But the Prophet's, you know, the personality of the Prophet, it wasn't just harsh, you know, warning, etc. But he was warm, he was tender, he was gentle, he was light-hearted at times. You know, one companion said that, you know, they have not seen a man smile as much as the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Wow. One person came to the Prophet and said, I need a riding beast, a camel. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, I'll give you the baby of a she camel. And he said, well, what good is that to me? And the Prophet laughed and said, well, isn't every camel the baby of a she camel? So, you know, that kind of light-hearted nature of his, the desire to make peace between people. So there's a conflict somewhere, and there's a hadith in Sahih Bukhari where the Prophet says, come, let's go and make peace between these people. The conquest of Mecca is an stunning example of that, because, you know, I mean, I've been catching up my history recently, and the norm, the sunnah of mankind is that when they conquer a city, they destroy it, they pillage it. It's terrible. And the example of the Prophet ﷺ on the conquest of Mecca is just phenomenal. It's unbelievable for a society at that time. The orderliness in which he walked into Mecca, the instructions he gave to the companions that there must be no bloodshed in this holy city, right? And remember, the city was full of non-Muslims at the time. It was full of the enemies of the Prophet who had killed his companions, who had killed his uncle and cut out his liver and chewed it. These are the people that the Prophet ﷺ said no man is to be harmed about, right? And gave very, very strict instructions about how there is going to be a peaceful takeover of the country. And then he marched, and all the different tribes of Muslims in their different regalia all marched through into the center of the city, you know, and it was a remarkable achievement, and a remarkable act of the Prophet ﷺ, where revenge would have been the norm in humanity. The Prophet ﷺ, his gentleness towards children, you know, we know about that. He'd sort of say, oh, I'll give such and such gift to you, whoever comes to me first, and the little kids all come and clamber over him, etc. There's hadith of him where he had some little girl on his shoulders when he was praying, and then as he'd go down to sajda, he'd put her down and then put back on his shoulders as he got up to pray, alayhi salatu wasalam. His selflessness, that whenever people asked him something, he'd just give it to them, right? If it belonged to him and they asked him, oh, that's nice, and he'd just give it to them, subhanallah. You know, his respect for women, in a society where there had been a grave disregard of women. You know, the best of you are those who are best to their families, and I am the best of you to my family. About rearing girls, and he says that those who will rear 2 girls till they come of age will be like this with me in the next world, you know, that close, and brought his fingers together. His love for people who are oppressed, his tenderness towards them, you know, all the stuff he said about animals, caring for orphans, you know, the hadith here, and his simplicity as well, his wearing of patched clothes, his living in such a simple way. Remember how he was lying one day and woke up, and he'd been lying on a reed mat on the floor, and Omar was crying, and he said, Ya Rasulullah, you know, all these kings out there who have comfortable beds, why you are, you know, the messenger of God, and you are living in such a simple and deprived way, essentially. And he said, you know, Ya Omar, what have I to do with this world? I am to this world like a stranger who comes and rests under a tree and then moves on. A rider who rests under a tree and moves on, subhanAllah. And that was the nature of the Prophet. When he left nothing, basically. So this is the Sunnah. This is the Sunnah, okay? And then the Imams of the madhabs are going to help us, the scholars help us to try and distill the Sunnah for individual circumstances, right? So when we have a look at, for instance, the different imams and how they understood the Sunnah, how they worked it out. Because remember, there are people who doted over the Messenger ﷺ. They'd recorded every single instance of what he said. Sometimes they didn't understand it, but they recorded it, they remembered it, and they passed it on. Okay, so there was a huge corpus of sayings and teachings, and the Imams were trying to make sense of this. So Imam Malik, for instance, his approach was that he understood Sunnah as not individual hadith necessarily, of course hadith as well, but also the teachings of companions, and particularly the general consensus in the city of the Prophet ﷺ, right? So his Muwatta, he put together a book called Muwatta, which means the approved, because he sent it to countless scholars in the city, and they all approved it, that this is encapsulating the practice of Medina. And it was important to do that because, of course, the city was beginning to change. It didn't change a huge amount, but it was beginning to change. The generations were going, the people of knowledge were dying out. So Imam Malik made a huge contribution by preserving that. So the Muwatta, which isn't a huge book, in fact, he distilled it down through his lifetime, made it smaller and smaller and more compact, is primarily a rule book, has lots of hadith in it, all of which are sahih. Some of them don't have chains because that wasn't his priority. The chains were there. You could go to all number of hadith scholars to get the chains, but this is a guidebook basically, right? And in it, he'll mention things like the practice or opinion I found the people practicing. For him, that meant Sunnah, right? What could be more valid than the city of the Prophet, where the Prophet stayed, 10,000 companions stayed and learnt, and the city that was shaped by the Prophet? If that city practices something, then surely that is the Sunnah, right? And that's his argument. Now, Imam Abu Hanifa, although closer in generation to the Prophet, was living in a more remote context. So his approach was, I ought to also mention with Imam Malik that the other thing that he did is that where have I got that here? Yeah, okay. So so he also would look at practicalities. So he would say that the Sunnah of the Prophet, in a way, it's like the greater Sunnah of the Prophet, was that when there was a practical need of the community, the Prophet would adapt his teachings to that. So Imam Malik also, when it was practical, would, in his guidebook, in his Muwatta, make a recommendation, right? Even if that didn't necessarily concord with the Sunnah. So for instance, we have the example that we did in the previous circle where in the Muwatta there's the story of the lady who's proposed to. She stands up, proposes to the Prophet remains silent, someone else says, oh, I'll marry you. She kind of agrees essentially, and the Prophet says, what mahar, what kind of dowry have you got to support her? He had nothing, and then eventually the Prophet said, well, do you know any Quran? And then he married the two together using a surah of the Quran as dowry. So Malik mentions that in his book to demonstrate that he knows about this hadith, but then he says, but I would put a minimum of a quarter of a dinar for the mahar, right? So he's thinking about, well, this is a practical rule book, a guidebook, and there's got to be some minimum mahar for the benefit of protection of women. Right, so that's Imam Malik. So Imam Abu Hanifa, and we studied him, an amazing character. His understanding was that actually the Sunnah has got to be about principles. So you bring together lots of hadith to understand what the overall Sunnah is. And also you're looking at the general teachings of the Quran as well. That if something's mentioned in the Quran as a general teaching, that stays, right? That's ultimate. And the hadith might be, sometimes if they're in direct conflict, then you might drop that hadith. It doesn't mean that you're saying it's inauthentic or that you're not following it, but it's just that you can't see how it will fit. It doesn't correlate, so you follow the Quran. Okay, or it might be that the hadith is showing a particular instance where it might be an exception just for that instance, right? So that's the way that he and his companions, because he took his students, and in a committee, they would thrash through problems, and they would kind of argue them until the principle emerged, and then they would then so that was the kind of deduction, and then after that they would then, or is that induction? Okay, okay. Anyway, after that, they would then test it out in lots of different circumstances. But Iraq, where he was based, was a society that was in constant flux. It had recently become Muslim. There were people of all kinds of philosophies and backgrounds, and so it was a situation where lots of new problems were occurring. So he could challenge the principles with new problems and make sure that the Sunna essentially is still coming through. The guidance that Islam ought to be offering people is still coming through. Now, the Hanafis also practice something called istihsan, which is basically where you look at, if you're looking at different evidences, because remember, there are lots of evidence, there's different hadith, and sometimes they don't always kind of correlate or sort of agree. There's also tons of opinions of companions as well, and they don't always agree as well. So he would veer towards an opinion which may not be, or a proof which may not be that strong compared to maybe like a direct hadith, for instance, but it would make the principles more consistent. So that's called istihsan. Okay, in order to create a corpus of rules and principles that are consistent and then can be applied to all sorts of new situations. The other thing that they also called Sunnah, the Hanafis also called Sunnah, was urf, and that's basically the customs and the practices of the people. Now, these people weren't the people of Medina, so Imam Malik also used urf, but he used the urf of Medina. But the Hanafis are saying that if you've got a kind of community, a Muslim community, even if they're a new Muslim community, but they're all generally practicing this, they're following the core teachings of Islam, and they're practicing this, okay, then that's acceptable, and you'll use that, and you'll call that Sunnah as well. So you can see how the idea of Sunnah was quite fluid at that time. I'll skip through that. I mean, you're welcome to sort of pause this, and you'll get the document later anyway, if you want to have a little look at. This is the discussion between Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik. So they met, actually, and Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik was a little bit concerned about too much free thinking that Abu Hanifa was doing. So Abu Hanifa explained to him that the context is very different in Iraq. So Imam Shafi comes along, and as you know, he's taught by the student of Imam Abu Hanifa and was a devoted follower of Imam Malik. So Imam Shafi did not like all this excessive reasoning, and his idea of the Sunnah was hadith. So he said that basically you have to follow hadith if you are going to define Sunnah. And remember, he's moving more and more, further and further away from the Prophet. The people who had seen the Prophet and seen his students and seen their students were beginning to die out. So that kind of living memory of the practice of the Prophet was dying. So the definition of Sunnah started to become a lot more fluid, and there were lots of different opinions going around. He said, look, make it simple. Authentic sayings of the Prophet is Sunnah. If he said it, if he did it, if other people were doing it, he saw it and didn't object, that is Sunnah. Nice and simple. And he put together a book called the Risala, which had very clear instructions on how to deduce the Sunnah, arguing against other sort of excessive reasoning, etc. as well. So in some ways that was his quite important contribution, and many scholars after that have taken that kind of idea on board pretty much. Not to say that it wasn't also useful to see the broader idea of Sunnah as well that came before him. So he didn't like istihsan, for instance. Istihsan, he thought as, well, this is whims and desires. What, you just prefer one particular opinion, even though it's a companion's over the Prophet ﷺ? How can you do that? That's not valid, right? So he has a chapter in one of his books on literally the invalidation of istihsan. So that was Imam Shafi. Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal kind of took, he was this, obviously this, a student of Imam Shafi, but also a great muhaddith. So he was devoted to the Prophet ﷺ, even though he was the kind of furthest away from him in the four great Imams. But he nonetheless felt that if you truly love the Prophet, you will follow him, even if you're not entirely sure that he exactly said that. Right, so he collected in his Musnad 27,000 hadith, but those hadith weren't all entirely authentic. They all had a probability of being said by the Prophet, and he would rather than apply any amount of reasoning, would rather follow that. Okay, Imam Shafi, on the other hand, allowed a degree of reasoning. He only wanted to take authentic hadith, and then with the reasoning, he allowed a little bit of kind of flexibility in, for instance, qiyas, which all the other schools used as well, which is analogical reasoning. This is where basically you have a hadith about a particular situation. Now you have a new situation, and you think, well, there's no answer. The Prophet didn't say anything about this new situation. But then you say, but hang on a sec, he said something about something which is very similar. Can't we use that hadith and apply it here? Do you see? So you look at, okay, well, what's similar? And the similarity is that underlying it, there's a purpose for that hadith, right? So for instance, the zakah on barley. So there's hadith of the Prophet which says that zakah is collected on barley. Now, when the Shafis moved to an area where the grain that people were using was rice, there's no hadith on rice. So they said, well, actually, what's the purpose of grain? It's a kind of non-perishable food stuff that is used for bartering. So it's a type of currency almost. Barley is what was used in Medina at the time of the Prophet. In other cultures, people are using rice, also a grain, also can be dried and stored. So surely zakah should be applicable to rice as well. Because if you go to a country where they just grow rice, they don't grow barley, and then you're not collecting zakah on rice, you're actually doing an injustice to the poor, because the whole idea was to collect money from the rich and share some with the poor, right? You see, so that was allowed. So he allowed a very restricted amount of qiyas. Then we have a look at how the different madhabs approached hadith. So we can see how the Hanafis, for instance, would only accept hadith for law if it was able to produce a principle. Now, in order to produce a principle, you needed lots of hadith. Do you see? So the Hanafis wouldn't just take one hadith and apply it. They would like to see that there's a number of hadith reinforcing and establishing a principle first. Okay. The Malikis, we know, would filter hadith through the practice of Medina. So if there's a hadith that's recorded and it's authentic, but it's not corresponding with practice, then it wouldn't be followed. It's not that it's rejected, but it's not followed, right? And that's a very important thing to bear in mind, that great imams will see a hadith, but they won't follow it if it's not substantiated by practice. Imam Shafi, we know, has a different approach, which is to accept all authentic hadith and follow them. But he had also a very clever, sophisticated way of that he proposed of reconciling hadith. And one thing that Imam Shafi was quite keen on is abrogation. So when you have two hadith and they seem to conflict, then there's a possibility that one may have abrogated, overwritten. Because sometimes, some rules came along, the Prophet changed them, right? Well, we know alcohol was allowed, then after a while it was forbidden. And the same happened. So, in the Quran, it says, don't come to prayer when you're intoxicated. But then that was abrogated with an express prohibition of alcohol, right? So similarly with hadith as well, that as context changed. So for instance, at one time, the Prophet forbade visiting graves because people would start to sort of, worship their ancestors, etc. And then he allowed it again. So Imam Shafi says that, okay, you've got two hadith that seem to conflict. One probably abrogates. But he would also do that with the Quran as well. If there's a hadith that conflicts with the Quran, chances, if it's an authentic hadith, it means the Prophet has abrogated that verse. Okay, the Hanafis were not keen on doing that. So that's the approach of the Shafis, and we've seen that Hanbalis would take even not quite so strong hadith and they would follow it. Now there's another group who I ought to mention here, who are the Salafis. So, you know, they're quite prevalent, also known as Ahl al-Hadith. I think their protagonists call them Wahhabis, which I don't think is exactly a term that Salafis like to use. But they like to call themselves Salafis. And, you know, they're very prevalent. You have them on campus as well. Many mosques are Salafi mosques. Saudi Arabia's official madhab, you might say, is the Salafi madhab. So it's worth knowing a little bit about where they stand. Now, they've quite often been called Hanbali, but they're not actually. I mean, in terms of creed, Salafis are definitely Hanbali, but in terms of the kind of the way that they approach hadith, they're more like the Shafis in that they will they're very uneasy about reasoning and want to stay as close to the authentic hadith as possible. Yeah, so it's a kind of Shafi'i type madhab actually in a way, but they like to say that they're not followers of any madhab, and they actually follow the they follow the way of the early predecessors. That's a bit difficult to assert because actually, you know, the early predecessors actually had different opinions on all sorts of things. All the companions had different opinions on loads of things, right? And the Imams were all early predecessors. They're all the Salaf. That's what Salaf means, is the predecessors. And the Imams were all predecessors as well. And they had different opinions on all sorts of stuff. So I think, you know, it's a nice idea to say you're a follower of the predecessors, but so is everybody really. You know, all the madhabs are actually. And you would say, well, aren't the Malikis of all people the followers of the predecessors? Because this is the community of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay. Now, the next question is, which madhabs embraced reason and which ones avoided it? Now, the interesting question about reason is that when your context is very close to the situation of the Prophet ﷺ, why would you apply reason? You know, if you're living a generation after the Prophet in the city of the Prophet, and the Prophet said, this is what you do it. Why wouldn't you? You love the Prophet, you want to follow his Sunnah, right? You want to be like the Prophet. So he says something, you follow it, okay? But we've seen the example of barley and rice, that when the situation and the society is very different, do you then continue to follow exactly what the Prophet said? Do you tax zakah on only barley? Or do you then have to use a bit of analysis, a bit of reasoning to say, what is the actual sunnah? Is the sunnah barley, or is the sunnah taxing wealth, right? And barley was an example of that. Do you see? So there's this kind of difference between different schools. In some ways, the Hanafis, originally the Malikis were called the Ahl al-Hadith, the people of Hadith, so the people who are close to literally following the Hadith. And the Hanafis were called Ahl al-Ra'i, the people of opinion, okay? Because, you know, they used a lot of thinking and opinions and analysis. But actually, when you look at it, actually the Hanafis and the Malikis in many ways are Ahl al-Ra'i, because the Malikis use maslaha, which is public benefit, and will suspend rulings if they go against public benefit and causing more harm, right? And the people who are very close to strictly following the Sunnah, as it's not the Sunnah because they're all following Sunnah, right? But the Hadith, strictly following Hadith, the Ahl al-Hadith really are the Hanbalis and the Shafis. And I suppose, you know, if you want to call the Salafis another madhab, then you'd say the Salafis as well, right? So these are the Ahl al-Hadith. The question now is, what are the pros and cons of being Ahl al-Ra'i versus Ahl al-Hadith, all right? So if you think about it, you could say that, well, isn't it dangerous the Prophet has said something and you're not following it. Isn't that dangerous? Or you're ignoring it and you're making a new ruling, which the Prophet never said. Isn't that dangerous? So you can see the argument of Ahl Hadith that if you want to stay safe, stick to the Hadith. Even if that means that you might be slightly deviating away from what the intention, maybe the intention of the lawgiver is, as some scholars use the term, the intention of the lawgiver. Even if you're not getting the intention, you're safer because you intend to follow the Prophet. That's your love to follow the Prophet, and you're going to do it, right? Even if it makes life a bit hard, even if it means that you're not necessarily doing what would maybe be most helpful in that situation, in that society, okay? So you can see the pros are that at least you'll get your reward for following the Sunnah of the Prophet, for following what you see as the Sunnah, literally. You know, it's there in black and white. There's no argument about this being the Sunnah. This is the Hadith. He's saying it. This is what he did. You're safe, right? But the cons, of course, are that as context moves away from the context of the Prophet, then you could end up with less and less relevance, because if you don't keep reinterpreting and applying the underlying message to a different context and adapting the rules to suit those new contexts and expand into that new context, right? And you just have the Hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then you actually end up making the role of the Prophet's teaching smaller and smaller in a way, yeah. But it's meant to be there for all times, for all places, for all contexts, and you're actually narrowing it. And so, of course, the reverse is true. So the Ahl Ra'i, you could say, you know, are trying to maintain the relevance of Islam for all times by looking at the underlying purposes of Islam. Okay, but the cons are that there's a risk now, right? Because that's your opinion, and loads of other people have other opinions. So who's right? Isn't there danger that you could have got it completely wrong? You've not followed the Sunnah. You've made up new rules for a new situation, but that's not actually the Sunnah. That's not what the Prophet would want to do in that situation, right? You got your analysis wrong. Yeah, you conjectured and you got it wrong. So it's dangerous. There's risk. The intention's good again, but there's risk. So do you see how there is a tension between the two, and who's right? So I'm going to end. I'll close the circle on this. We will get to analyzing hadith. So we're literally on the brink of that now, inshallah. Okay, but I want to just finish with this question of who's right. Are the people who analyze and think about the deeper purpose of the hadith right? Or are the people who just take it literally and stay, you know, safe, you might say, right? Well, this question actually came along at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, so the Prophet sallallahu said he dispatched a group of companions and he told them, none of you is to pray Asr except at Banu Qurayza. Right, get to this place called Banu Qurayza, which is actually where the tribe was based. Pray Asr at Banu Qurayza, he said. Okay, now they got delayed in getting to Banu Qurayza, and Asr time was finishing. They hadn't got to Banu Qurayza. So some companions said, the Prophet said, pray Asr at Banu Qurayza. I know time's gone. I know it's going to be Maghrib, it might be Isha, but we're going to pray Asr when we get to Banu Qurayza. The other companion said, no, the point was, Asr, the times of the prayer are established. You don't change those. The point of the Prophet ﷺ was that he meant to get to Banu Qurayza fast, so you're there in time for Asr. So they prayed Asr on the right time, and the other group missed their Asr prayer and they prayed it late. But they followed the actual teaching of the Prophet, the instruction of the Prophet to the letter, right? So what happened? They went back to the Prophet ﷺ. They explained their disagreement, right? And this is Sahih Bukhari. And the Prophet ﷺ didn't berate any of the two groups, right? He didn't. He stayed quiet. So actually what the Prophet ﷺ has endorsed is both ways of looking at things. Yeah. So you have some scholars who are very analytical and they give you pragmatic, realistic, helpful, applied solutions to your problems. And there are other scholars who will say, just do it this way because the Prophet said, da, da, da. Okay. If you want to follow that, you want to follow the literal approach, the Prophet is basically saying that he's endorsing that as well. And if you want to follow the analytical approach, he endorses that too. Remember, all times we're saying you can't just figure this out for yourself. The knowledge is too great, but you need scholars who understand the Sunnah in its various forms, in its different ways of looking at it, to decide what the best course of action is. But you can follow either, and it's still okay, right? That's the point. Khair, we will finish today. And next week we'll carry on with actually looking at lots and lots of specific examples of hadith that can cause a bit of consternation, and then look at the principles of how we can, how scholars approach these hadith, inshallah. Okay, the committee is going to be meeting right now, so just bear that in mind. And inshallah, otherwise I will close now. If anybody wants to voice a question right now before we close, by all means do. Otherwise, we'll wrap up. Have a few seconds. Okay, great. So we'll close. Subhanak Allahumma wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Al-asr. إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Ya Allah, we pray that you keep us safe in these difficult times. You keep people's jobs safe. You keep their livelihoods, their efforts in studying safe. Keep people away from harm. Protect our elderly people as well, Ya Allah, in these very, very difficult times. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.